As quickly as Baghdad erupted, Moqtada al-Sadr supporters went home. All it took was a word from the leader, a demonstration of force by the populist Shiite cleric, as this has protracted coalition building in Iraq spills over into a power play with neighbouring Iran as well. Can Moqtada al-Sadr stare down pressure from across the border and from his Shia rivals? His umpteenth announcement on Monday that he was quitting politics, the trigger for clashes that killed at least 30. His followers braving bullets and taking a leaf out of Sri Lanka's recent uprising, storming Government House, taking a dive in the giant Saddam Hussein-era pool. Now, after Monday's euphoria and bloodshed, comes a sudden cooling off. What next? The country's president hinting that Moqtada al-Sadr may get his wish and snap elections. Will the showdown break a 10-month-old stalemate in forming a government? Has the specter of civil war dissipated for good? Can nationalist and pro-Tehran rivals afford to be playing with fire? What after seeing off the 2019 uprising from the Shia heartland that challenged the establishment and the corruption and mismanagement of the status quo? Today in the France 24 debate, is it Moqtada al-Sadr's moment? Joining us from Istanbul, Borzu Daragahi, international correspondent for English newspaper The Independent. How are you?
Good. Great to be back on the show.
From Stockholm, Laib Igel, senior analyst at Crisis Group. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
From Manchester, Ruba Ali Al-Hassani, sociologist at Lancaster University. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And from Baghdad, he took part in the 2019 uprising. Otman Marzoug is lecturer in English at Al-Faraidi University. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have, on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Already last month, Moqtada al-Sadr, you could say, sent his calling card to coalition rivals within the so-called coordination framework. They then stormed parliament. Now this new show of force. Will he get that wish for snap elections? Catherine Viet has more.
Calm is slowly returning to the streets of Baghdad after cleric Moqtada al-Sadr demanded his supporters withdraw from the capital.
I still believe that the Sadrist movement is disciplined and obedient. Those who are conducting a sit-in in front of the parliament must leave, otherwise I will disavow them. The demonstrations, even peaceful ones, must stop.
Heeding the call, many of the influential cleric's followers headed out from the Green Zone.
Following our leader Moqtada al-Sadr's orders to withdraw within 60 minutes, we withdrew.
Iraq's military also announced it was lifting a nationwide curfew that had been imposed to contain 2 days of deadly unrest. The country is in the midst of a months-long governmental crisis that was made worse when Sadr announced on Monday that he was withdrawing from politics. The news spurred his followers to storm the Green Zone and breach the gates of the Republican Palace, with some even taking a dip in the palace's pool. Clashes broke out between Sadr's supporters and Iraqi security services, as well as with members of other Shiite militias, turning the Green Zone into a war zone. Officials say at least 30 people were killed in the fighting. Iraq has been politically deadlocked since last October's parliamentary elections, in which no party won an outright majority. Months of infighting have followed, culminating in the recent deadly chaos. Concerns that the unrest might spread caused neighboring Iran to briefly close its shared border with Iraq.
Yeah, let's begin by trying to make sense of what just happened. Otman Marzoug, what's it felt like being in Baghdad the last 24 hours?
Well, in the beginning, thank you for having me. Now we're in Baghdad for the 3 last hours. It is a kind of peace. We are now having some part of peace, but in reality, just before these 3 hours, there's a bloodshed because of demonstrations that led by the cleric and religious leader Moqtada al-Sadr. And we know Moqtada al-Sadr participated in many other movements. But is it truly Moqtada al-Sadr trying to solve the problem of corruption in Iraq? This is the true question behind these movements that Moqtada al-Sadr led many times.
So you're questioning his intentions, Othman, but let me ask you how you felt personally. Were you scared the last 24 hours?
Of course, all the Iraqis are scared. There's a war between two militias, and the people like us, the simple people, or the people who just want to live, they feared of being killed by one of these militias. There are two militias, the Al-Mahdi army or Sarai al-Salam, and the other militias that are the proxies of Iran. So all of us are afraid of being killed.
Laib Higel, what just happened? What's just happened the last 24 hours?
Well, there has been a long time coming escalation between these two rival sides. Sadr has had a hard time accepting that he cannot form a government despite winning most seats in the October 2021 elections. And when his rivals sought to form a government instead, in July, nominating a prime minister candidate that was unacceptable to Sadr because he saw him as close to his arch-rival, the former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, he called on his followers and supporters to descend on the streets. And so we've seen an occupation of parliament, demonstrations in front of the Judicial Council, for instance. And I think that the main ignition of what happened in the past 24 hours was a statement by a marja, an important religious authority in Iraq, Kadhim al-Ha'ari, that stated that he will be retiring, which is very unusual for a cleric at his level. And on top of that, encouraging his supporters to instead emulate Khamenei. And this cleric is essentially the one who succeeded Moqtada al-Sadr's father. So for Sadr, this has, sort of stripped him of some of the legitimacy that he draws out of coming from a clerical family, despite not having the same credentials as a marja. And I think that in this show of force, he was trying to show his rivals that he is ready to escalate further before stopping in order to force concessions from the other side. And therefore, we saw the statement from him today where he sort of retracted or asked his supporters to leave the green zone and also criticized them for the violence perpetrated.
Yeah, even issuing an apology. Let me ask you, Borzu Dargahi, again, as was rightly pointed out by Laib, this trigger coming with this sudden resignation of Moqtada al-Sadr's, I guess you could call him a spiritual referent, officially because of age and illness, Ayatollah Hadim al-Hari, who resides in Iran, in the holy city of Qom, since the 1970s, calling, as she rightly points out, for loyalty to Iran's spiritual leader. Al-Sadr, in a Monday tweet, saying that he felt that the resignation was not out of his own volition. Is this about Iran, or is it about rivals that are backed from Iran?
I think it is partly about rivals that are backed from Iran. But this, as the other guests have pointed out, this tension has been building for years. And you add to that this period of drift. Okay, over the last couple decades, every time there's been an election in Iraq, there's been a period of government formation. And it takes weeks and months and months and months to form a government. And in that period, it's always been a very dangerous time when there's been these outbursts of violence. In the past, it's been between Shia and Sunni. Now it's between Shia and Shia, since the Sunni are no longer a relevant military force in the country. And so yes, it's about Iran. It's about the spoils. It's about allegations of corruption. It's about, who has the most power. And the bottom line is, the problem is that Sadr doesn't have enough power. Sadr doesn't have enough power to form a government, and he's not able to accept that, as the crisis group analyst pointed out. But he also doesn't have enough military power to take control either. It was mentioned that there was Iraqi security forces as well as Shia militia fighting Moqtada Sadr, but it is my understanding that it was mostly the Shia, and that there was mostly the Shia militia against Shia militia, and the Iraqi army largely stood back on this one. So you can imagine what would happen to Moqtada's guys if the army had stepped in at this point, an army that has experienced fighting against ISIS at this point. So at this point, he doesn't, yes, he is maybe the largest political actor in the country, but his ambitions outstrip his ability to impose those ambitions.
So what seems at face value like a show of strength actually showed up as weakness, is what you're saying?
Oh, I mean, in a sense, yeah, he couldn't. I mean, the bottom line is he can't win this game. Maybe they'll call for another round of elections. I think that there is just as much apathy among Iraqis right now. Turnout will be rather low. And once again, he won't get enough to form a government on his own, even if he somehow manages to convince the Sunni and Kurd factions to form a coalition with him, as he's tried to do over the last 11 months. So, this goes on and on and on until some kind of adults take over and form a government and address the problems of the Iraqi people instead of who sits in which chair.
Ruba Ali Al-Hassani, you agree?
Hi. Yes, I agree to an extent. I also would like to emphasize that this is a battle for legitimacy, for political legitimacy to form the government, as discussed earlier. Each political party is trying really hard. They're more desperate than ever to be seen as legitimate in the eyes of the people. And we've never seen them this desperate before. Since the October elections of 2021, where there was very low turnout compared to any other election in Iraqi history, especially, soon after 2003, when there were, explosions and terrorist attacks, there was still very high turnout. So compared to that, there's very low turnout, and all the politicians want to seek legitimacy. And the reason is that the Tishreen, or October 2019 protest movement, has pushed for this, has pushed for every politician to try to appear as relevant, to try to appear as legitimate in the eyes of the people. And this, what we are seeing today, is an outcome of the October or Tishreen protest movement. It managed to successfully disturb the status quo. It managed to successfully shake Iraqi politics. Right now, what we see are negative outcomes, but over the long term of events, it's actually only one stage through which Iraq is going to go through, and there are many other stages through which Iraq will go. And this desperate attempt to gain legitimacy in the eyes of the people is just pushing politicians to do things that we may have not seen them do before. However, at the same time, we're seeing some actors, especially Moqtada Sadr, repeat what he has done in the past. He is the boy who cried wolf. We all know that. He keeps on saying that he will quit politics, but he will return. He quits politics. He's done it at least 6 times, and at least twice in the past year. So what we've seen take place over the past 24 hours is another stunt. It's performative.
You say, hang on, you say it's another stunt, Ruba, but we have the Iraqi president who in the last hour, according to the Reuters news agency, says that early elections could resolve political tensions and a way out of the crisis. Is he handing Moqtada al-Sadr what he wants on a silver platter?
He might, but the question is, what would new elections do for Iraqis? If the latest election had very low turnout, the turnout this time might be even lower, because the Tishreen movement has shown that people have no faith in the political system. They want to disrupt the system, they want to dissolve the system, they want to rebuild the system to a model that is not built on power sharing and ethno-confessional consociational governance. The people want an actually democratic representative system that is not based on identity, one that is based on merit, one that is based on the interests of the actual people, not of corrupt leaders.
And for now, the question is what role Moqtada al-Sadr has going forward. His followers firing at Baghdad's fortified green zone with rocket-propelled grenades earlier before that call for nonviolence and that apology. The populist cleric not alone, and the star power, you can also call him a mainstay of Iraqi politics ever since 2003 and the U.S.-led invasion that toppled Saddam Hussein. Kathy Kadir-Clifford has more.
Moqtada al-Sadr was little known beyond Iraq before the 2003 US-led invasion. He then became a symbol of resistance to occupation, drawing on his family legacy. Saddam Hussein had his father, the Grand Ayatollah Mohammad Sadiq al-Sadr, assassinated in 1999. With his Mahdi army, al-Sadr led 2 anti-US revolts and was wanted dead or alive by Washington. Over the years, his followers have also fought the Iraqi army during the country's sectarian 2006 to 2008 civil war, Islamic State militants, and rival Shiite militias. After suffering major defeat in Basra in 2008, Sadr ordered a halt to armed operations. He then stepped into politics, gaining popularity with his promises to stamp out state corruption. A self-proclaimed Shiite nationalist, al-Sadr opposes all American as well as Iranian influence in Iraq.
Iraq belongs only to Iraqis. All weapons must be in the hands of the state.
In 2016, Sadr led the first anti-government uprising in Iraq's young democracy when his supporters stormed parliament. In 2018, he formed an alliance with communists and secularists, doing well in parliamentary elections. Since then, his Sadrist movement has come to dominate Iraqi politics, coming first in 2021 parliamentary elections. Despite his influence, in June 2022, al-Sadr failed to end a prolonged stalemate over forming a government.
I decided to withdraw from the political process so as not to participate in any way with corrupt people.
Al-Sadr then took a further step back this August, announcing the closure of his movement's offices.
Laipi Gill, how much traction does that nationalist rhetoric get you in Iraq these days?
Well, I think that it still gains some traction. There are parts of Iraqi society that is also, let's say, outside of the Sadrist trend that between these two rival Shiite factions sort of would veer towards Sadr because of his nationalist rhetoric, because of adopting, let's say, the rhetoric or the narrative of the streets, and especially the Tishreen movement that very much came out against the corrupt system, the Muhassasa system of ethno-political apportionments. He states that he is for reform, pro-constitutional changes, etc. But of course, most Iraqis do see through this and are quite worried that if Sadr would come to dominate a government in the future, it would simply be to amass power that he so far has had to share with his Shiite rivals.
And yet there are, we spoke with one analyst earlier who said those in Washington who see Moqtada al-Sadr right now as being blowing back against Tehran and therefore perhaps somebody that the West can do business with. Your thoughts on that?
It's true that many Western actors, let's say, that have a stake in Iraq look to Sadr as a potential bulwark, let's say, against the more pro-Iran lenient factions among the Shia parties. I'm not sure that this is a correct assessment, simply because Sadr in the past has also been reliant on Iran. His relationship on Iran might not be as straightforward as it is for some of the other Shia political parties, but he cannot rid himself of it. He's tried to steer some sort of course that speaks to the people, saying neither Eastern nor Western, trying to strike that nationalist chord that has definitely been on the rise in Iraq, and especially since the uprising of 2019. But I think as a sort of one package solution for Iraq, it is not the way to go.
Borzo Dargahi, he has had his ups and his downs ever since 2003. Moqtada al-Sadr. Have his rivals underestimated him?
I don't think so. I think that his rivals see who he is, and they're quite intimidated by him. They've assessed him quite accurately as a threat, and they have been mobilizing and organizing over the last few weeks when he first breached the green zone to prepare for this day, knowing that it would come. And so you saw the quick reaction of the Shia militias and some of the security forces. The other thing I will say about Moqtada is that he is on this sort of anti-corruption kind of campaign, but his people have been in Iraq's ministries and in the administration since the very beginning, and they have been as corrupt and as incompetent as the rival. So I don't think that, and as crooked as well, I don't think that the Sadrists have a leg really to stand on when they talk about anti-corruption. We were talking about Iran a little bit. He has railed against Iran when it suited him. The Iranian establishment is fine with him. They're fine with him railing against them. They're a good he's a good chip on the poker table for the Iranians, because just in case Iraqis go nationalist, he's a nationalist alternative that the supreme leader of Iran could live with, because he is so anti-American and anti-Western, and he's also, and this should be noted, I've met Moqtada al-Sadr. He's an extremist. I mean, he is a very, very extreme fundamentalist Muslim who his positions on gay rights, women's rights, etc., are rather out there. And for Western leaders and some Gulf Arab leaders to support him as a bulwark against Iran is at best misguided.
Even though he reaches out to the Sunnis, the Kurds, the communists.
I mean, yeah, but I think that there is, first of all, with regard to the communists, there has long been a partnership between the Shia factions and some of the communist factions that has historically been a reality in Iraq. And other political parties reach out to those factions as well. That he's willing to form a coalition with them is smart. It's a good kind of positive aspect of what he's doing. But some of the other Shia factions have also been willing to form partnerships with the Sunnis, including, Haider Abadi and the current prime minister, Mustafa al-Kadhimi. It's the Sunnis and Kurds that are more standoffish towards some of the Shia factions.
The current president of Iraq, who under the constitution is a Kurd, again, saying he's in favor now.
The president has very little power. Barham Saleh is a good guy. I've known him for years, but the president is more of a ceremonial post in Iraq than anything. It's really a prime ministerial system. I think the others will agree with that.
Right, but he's saying he's in favor of snap elections to, quote, get out of the crisis. Othman Marzouk, your reaction to that?
All right, Moqtada al-Sadr get 37 parliament member, and he withdraw. What is the benefit of a new election? There is no benefit behind a new election. It is not going to solve the problem.
He right now has 73 seats in parliament. He gained seats in the last legislature. If the turnout is even lower this time around, if there are snap elections, he could have even more seats in the National Assembly.
Even if he has more seats, he's not going to be able to form the government easily, because there are other militias who are not going to give him power and enable him to make a government. Because Moqtada al-Sadr himself had a grudge, kind of a grudge, personally against Nur-Maliki. And Iran is not going to give him a permission to create that government he dreams about. United States is not going to give him that permission. Marju'iyya, Sistani, is not going to give him that permission. The three players in this game are al-Marju'iyya, Iran, and the United States. They are not going to give him permission to create what he dreams about. Even if he get 100 parliament member in the Iraqi parliament.
Ruba Ali al-Hassani, you hear there the mention by Othman of Iraq's former prime minister, Nouri al-Maliki. Nouri al-Maliki, who seemed politically washed up when he left the prime minister's post, and yet he seems to be right now the big rival to Moqtada al-Sadr. What are your thoughts on his political fortunes?
Nour al-Maliki is not going to be prime minister.
Let me put it to Ruba Ali al-Hassani.
Nour al-Maliki and Moqtada al-Sadr have a long history together that is rife with violence and antagonism. And there was Sawlat al-Fursan many years ago where Maliki's government ran a military campaign to fight al-Mahdi army. That's what it was called at the time in Basra. And because of that period, Moqtada al-Sadr has had to rebrand from al-Mahdi army to Saraya al-Salam, or the Peace Brigades, trying to rebrand himself and his movement and trying to bring himself as a reformer as opposed to an insurgent or one who leads an insurgency against the US presence at the time. And the idea of him being a reformer, as discussed by our other panelists, doesn't sit well with Iraqis who are very well aware of his role. He is part of the establishment. And this is a pattern we are seeing in many countries around the world, not just in Iraq, where members of the establishment try to sell themselves to voters and to constituents as someone who would challenge the establishment, who will bring about reform, who will bring about change. But they have a long history as being part of the establishment, being part of corruption, being part of kleptocratic systems of governance and violence. And the groups that we see engaging in politics today seem to only know violence. That's their only language in which they speak, whether it's physical violence or verbal violence in the form of ultimatums and threats. They do not engage in reconciliatory and restorative dialogue. They do not care to engage in the kind of dynamic that would bring Iraq and its political system forward. We have been in one stalemate after another after every election. And if we've had a number of elections since 2003, but how many of them resulted in an elected government as opposed to one that has been comprised of politicians propped up by ethno-confessional representation and party quotas, etc. And this is why Iraqis feel like they have not been seen, they have not been heard. They're they've already lost faith in the electoral system. They feel that if they vote, it's not going to matter. The popular vote will be overridden with party and ethno-confessional quotas. So what's the point? So to answer a previous question about upcoming elections, what will be different when the losers in the election refuse to recognize that they are losing the elections, or they have lost the election? We have Stop the Vote protests that the strategic framework had soon after the elections, which reminds us of similar, rallies in the US and other parts of the world where some parties refuse to acknowledge that they lost. So what will change if we have another election? What will be different? And I've spoken about this before, where an election would be pointless if we don't engage in some sort of restorative practice that is built on accountability. Iraqis want accountability. They want an end to a culture of impunity. And if we don't hold anyone accountable, then we're just recycling the same faces over and over again every election cycle. And that's literally what will happen the next time if we do have another early election. The same people will be there. No one will be held accountable. Even the High Judicial Council these days is being seen as, or not just these days, but more so these days, is being seen as part of the problem. You're not holding people accountable. You're not holding politicians and murderers accountable. So what will change? Something's got to give.
Bigel, how much does public opinion matter in today's Iraq? Have the last 24 hours proved that come what may, might is right?
Well, public opinion, unfortunately, has not had much of an impact on the current developments. These are tensions playing out between the elites of Iraqi politics, and the streets are standing on the sidelines. We might have people that are demonstrating, but they are demonstrating on behalf of the elites. This is quite a different situation from 2019, where we saw a genuine sort of grassroots uprising in Iraq. However, we have a demographic situation in Iraq that cannot be denied, and sooner or later these Iraqi political elites will have to face that. A significant portion of the population is under the age of 25. We have about 700,000 young people that enter the labor market every year. These people have a different outlook at life. They don't carry the same sort of conflictual opinions vis-a-vis each other, vis-a-vis other ethno-sectarian groups in the country. They believe that the current political system is rigged against the average Iraqi. And as Ruba was saying, they do not believe in the legitimacy of the system. However, I wouldn't completely disregard the value of elections. Despite the low voter turnout, there was a significant amount of new parliamentarians that were able to make it into parliament this time around. And although they could not have an impact on the politics because parliament has not been functional since elections, this is an important indication that there is a will of a younger generation of Iraqis to actually take responsibility for their own country, to enter politics. Now, how can we allow space for these new ideas, new minds, to actually have a say in shaping the future of their own country? And this is definitely the most challenging question. As Ruba was saying as well, the political elites are clinging on to the power that they have. They want to expand it. And this is also why we see the current tensions playing out. I think that the current impasse is dangerous. It has proved dangerous, although we have reached the sort of ceiling of escalation for now, considering Sadr's statement to withdraw people from the streets. But they remain. And so how do you resolve that? At the end of the day, we cannot get rid of the political establishment that we have for the moment. So some sort of reset is needed in order to embark on new dialogue, hopefully, in the future. Elections could be one way to do that. But I don't see a possibility for accountability at this point in Iraq. Who is going to hold who accountable?
Yeah, Atman Marzouk, elections could be a way out if there are alternatives, if there are candidates who don't subscribe to the old patterns of the old alliances according to sectarian, religious, ethnic lines?
All right, election, it might be an alternative, but without the existence of militias, this is the only choice. If we want to create an election that could be the answer to our problems, is to demolish and remove all the militias or the proxies of Iran. This is the answer. With the existence of militias, elections has no point, or election has no point, because, as you said, might is right. those who have power on the ground are not the politicians. This is the truth. Those who have power on the ground are militias. In the media, politicians speak and say that they do have the power, but in reality, on the ground, we do know that they cannot prevent a militian member from killing even. We do remember our friend Hisham al-Hashimi. He's been killed. Till now, the one who killed him has not been judged.
There's no accountability is what you're saying. Borzo Daragahi, listening to this conversation, you can't help but be reminded of, I guess, the mirrored situation in Lebanon, where in 2019, there was also a protest movement against entrenched interests and established order. And more recently, there were elections where there were a few candidates who got elected who did not subscribe to these sectarian or religious or ethnic labels. But it's only a small minority.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that the Iraqi situation in some ways mirrors the Lebanon situation. And, you know, in both countries, you have systems that were set up after violent kind of political changes and collapses. In the case of Lebanon, the civil war. In the case of Iraq, the U.S. occupation and dismantling of the Saddam Hussein's regime, and subsequent creation of these, as an analyst pointed out, these sort of ethno-sectarian equations and power sharing agreements. And what that means in both countries is that issues like you know, politicians are so busy kind of grabbing hold of power and amassing riches and watching out to see what their rivals are doing. No one is addressing things like improving collapsing healthcare systems, improving education systems, dealing with issues that are super important in countries like Iraq, like agriculture and water and so on. No one is addressing these issues in a responsible, systemic way, and the country drifts towards failure, drifts towards collapse. We saw that in Lebanon with the explosion at the port of Beirut, where the incompetence and the complete lack of regard for public service and public duty on the part of the political class led to tragedy for the people, and Iraq is going in that direction as well.
Going in that direction as well. So do you see this current standoff as a standoff between Shiites or a standoff between the nomenclatura, between the halves?
I think the Shiite thing is a mask for just a fight among various elites, and they'll deal the Sunnis and Kurds in when they need to. I wonder what the others think of that assessment. But you know, they play the Shia card when it's useful for them, the same way, I don't know, Trump whips out the American flag when it's useful for him. But it's really about power and advantage.
Laib Higel?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Well, is this a power struggle between Shias, or just a power struggle between the elite?
The elites.
I mean, the power struggle really consumes all of the political elite. Right now, it is mainly playing out among the Shia house, as we call it. However, I mean, Sunnis and Kurds are significant in this equation as well. But what we've seen in past government formation processes is that usually when there is high tension within the Shia house that dominates Iraqi politics because of its majority, these other groups tend to stand back until those issues are resolved, because they would need to see, you know, sort of where the cards land in order to decide on their own position vis-a-vis these Shia elites. Now, in the case of the Kurds and Sunnis this time around, it has been very clear that they've been veering more towards Sadr rather than, let's say, the more pro-Iranian side for quite a simple reason. In the case of the Kurdish parties and specifically the KDP, they have been struggling with the presence of paramilitary groups on the border of the Kurdistan region since the military victory over ISIS. And also, to some extent, obviously, they have been attacked inside the Kurdistan region. The same thing goes for many of the Sunnis who are experiencing difficulties in their areas in central Iraq because of the proliferation of armed groups in these areas in the post-ISIS period.
So, Ruba Ali al-Hassani, how do you get to the place where we get beyond these divides?
Thank you for asking this question because it connects directly to my research and the work that we're doing at Lancaster University's Project CEPAD. We explore sectarianization and desectarianization both as social and political processes where political actors, institutions, and systems condition people to think in sectarian terms. And it's sort of parallel to the racialization of society. So it pushes people to think in terms of identity, to look at things from the lens of identity and fixate on that in divisive sense. And according to our research, we've seen that Lebanon, Iraq, although there are many similarities between them, there's also a difference where some people in Lebanon do support the ethno-sectarian consociational system, but just want it to be more competent and non-corrupt in its way of performance, in political performance. Whereas in Iraq, there is greater opposition to the ethno-confessional consociational system, as we have seen from the Tishreen or October protest movement, and as we continue to see today, because my argument is that the Tishreen or October movement has not finished. It has not ended in any way. It has stopped in the form of street protests, but it continues in the form of mobilization, both online and offline. And we're seeing some parties that have emerged from the protest movement still mobilizing behind the scenes, recruiting and traveling across the country and getting more supporters. And in connection with that, I would also like to invite everyone engaging in the discourse on Iraq to perhaps try to avoid looking at things from a purely Western lens or from a purely sectarian lens, which is Iran versus the US. Indeed, there are proxies in Iraq for both countries, and indeed that Iran plays a very big role in Iraq, and so does the US and many other countries. Iraq is a battlefield for so many conflicts between neighboring and non-neighboring countries. But at the same time, I always invite people to center Iraqi voices on the ground in these conversations. We need to focus on Iraqi sovereignty from the eyes of Iraqi people, the Iraqi statehood from the eyes of the Iraqi people. So what do elections tell us? What do protests tell us? What do social movements tell us? And we're seeing that Iraq is moving in a very different direction. It is moving towards desectarianization. So if people are conditioned and pushed to look at things from a sectarian lens, they can also conditioned and pushed and encouraged to think in a desectarianized lens, to think more in terms of national identity. And things may be different in the Kurdish north from the rest of the country, but it is at the same time similar, not so different. Many Western outlets do not focus on how the similar process that's taking place in Baghdad and the rest of the country is going on in the Kurdish region, where protests emerge every year due to the conditions there, and they continue to be subjected to a violent crackdown, forcible disappearances, just like in Baghdad and other parts of the country, imprisonments, the silencing of journalists, of activists. So the same process that's taking place in Baghdad and Diqar and many parts of the country is also taking place in the Kurdish region.
Taking place in other parts of the country. I want to thank you so much, Ruba Ali al-Hassani, for being with us from Manchester. I want to thank Lai Bigel in Stockholm, Borzu Daragahi in Istanbul, Atman Marzouk for being with us from the Iraqi capital. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.